The next item on the agenda I have decided to skip. That was under Objectivity Theory. Can you prove objectivity? In a nutshell, the answer to that question is the concept of proof presupposes objectivity. Now, I think it's okay if I skip this for a few reasons. First of all, what I had prepared is essentially an answer to a misguided question, a misguided objection that we sometimes encounter. But as such, it is less valuable than I think further positive work that we can do today. Secondly, that handout that I gave you yesterday is a brief way of dealing with this question. So you've already got something on it. But this way we can save some time today for, again, what I think is ultimately really more valuable constructive material. Okay. And I'm not even going to give you a minute to protest today because we do have a lot to cover. All right. So then getting on to the next item on the agenda. Well, actually, before I do that, let's take a little stock of where we are just to remind you of some of what we did yesterday. Where are we? Yesterday, I stressed that objectivity is a matter of being object-focused. The Latin roots of the word indicate that being objective is a matter of paying attention to that which is thrown in front of you, we saw. Objectivity is a method of thinking. It means reasoning, reaching conclusions according to the relevant evidence, and setting aside extraneous considerations. Objectivity consists of volitional, deliberate adherence to reality by self-consciously using logic. Now, a word on logic here, because this may have been unclear to some people, or some people may be coming in with a certain misconception. Logic technically is not the same thing as reason. Logic is the more systematic identification of patterns of valid and invalid inferences. Okay? When Aristotle discovered logic, we don't mean that he discovered reason. We mean that he started identifying forms of deduction, forms of inference that were valid and those that were fallacious. Okay? He was systematizing more specific forms of reasoning. Okay? And again, logic is crucial to being objective. All of that's a quick reminder about yesterday. So now, next on the agenda, why is objectivity appropriate? Why be objective? Let's carry on there. That's the last point under the theory of objectivity. Well, we saw a few days ago, or yesterday, sorry, getting all confused here. We saw one of these days, I think it was yesterday, that objectivity is indispensable to rationality. That objectivity is a prerequisite for rationality. Consequently, objectivity is valuable for all the reasons that rationality is valuable. You should be objective in order to reap all the benefits of accurately grasping reality. Recall from a few days ago why you should be rational. To grasp reality so as to guide your judgments and actions. Given the primacy of existence, we noticed, you must act in accordance with reality in order to succeed in achieving any of your values. The mandate behind rationality is practicality, to achieve your purposes and live. Now, when it comes to explaining the value of objectivity, there isn't a big, separate, additional case to be made. Attention to objectivity does have significant value in focusing the instruction be rational a little bit more narrowly. Focus your attention on the object in question, it says, on the issue of relevance, and on the method to employ to be rational, namely logic. The need for objectivity arises because of the nature of our minds and the complexity of many of the facts that we are attempting to reason about, okay? But essentially the payoff is the same with objectivity as it is with reason. What you're getting is the same, reality. Now, I'll admit that while I was working on this a few weeks ago, initially I was somewhat disappointed at this stage. I thought, well, this won't do. And really, there were a few days there where I was trying to drum up further reasons to be objective. Because, you know, we'd already seen earlier in the week that rationality delivers reality, and you don't want an anticlimactic ending late in the week, right? You want a little bit more punch, a little bit more juice, until I started thinking again, but be realistic. And it's reality that you get for being objective. What do you want? Heaven, right? I mean, so in essence, essentially then, I think the answer to why be objective echoes the answer to why be rational. To access reality, to reach accurate conclusions about that which exists. And the reason to do that, again, is practicality. To achieve your purposes, to live, to advance values consonant with your living. You can't run a profitable business if you're not objective in making decisions about manufacturing, marketing, personnel, etc. You can't coach a successful team if you're not objective in your decisions about who makes the team, who plays, what the team rules are, etc. You can't be successful in anything if you're not objective in tending your health and happiness, your physical and emotional well-being. Like all irrational decisions, when you're not objective, you're omitting or distorting reality. But existence is primary. Things don't change depending on your beliefs or attitudes toward them. Thus, non-objectivity thwarts your purposes. It's self-defeating, counterproductive. It makes sense to be objective to navigate the world successfully. Okay. So that concludes that section, part 4. And we can now move on to part 5, what I've called the practice of objectivity. As we did with rationality, we're going to turn our attention to particular ways of failing to be objective and some lessons that we might learn from these. Now, given the very close relationship between rationality and objectivity, there is considerable overlap in temptations away from objectivity as well as in its requirements, okay? Also, please don't worry. I will spend most of today on the forms of irrationality. Don't worry that, oh my God, we're never going to get to the requirements. I have very little to add on the requirements. We can go through that very quickly, so don't be distracted by that worry, okay? All right, so various forms of non-objectivity, the traps, again, that one can easily fall into. One major lure away from objectivity is falling into one of the widespread misconceptions of what objectivity is. Several of these misconceptions are widely circulated in our culture. In such a case, a person can be trying very hard to be objective, but if he's working with an erroneous notion of what objectivity is, he's not going to succeed in actually being objective, okay? So I want to start by quickly indicating a few things that objectivity is not, that it is commonly confused with or commonly claimed to be by other people, okay? A few things that objectivity is not. First of all, it is not a matter of putting yourself in another person's shoes. I mean, we see that idea in various forms quite frequently. Objectivity is not a matter of putting yourself in another person's shoes, seeing things from another person's point of view. Why not? Why isn't that what objectivity is? Because that would merely swap one person's perspective for another's. But it says nothing about what that other person's views are, or how he arrived at those views, or whether they represent adherence to reality by the method of logic. Remember, objectivity is an attempt to get at reality, the way things are, not at some other person's view of reality. As we've said earlier, no position is right just because it's that person's position, whether it's mine, yours, or some other guy's. So simply adopting another person's perspective bypasses what's actually pivotal, the relevant facts. Another person's perspective, another person's conclusions may or may not be justified, but you won't know that until you do a first-hand check on it. Okay? Similarly, objectivity is not taking all points of view into account, balancing different opinions, perspectives, interests, preferences. A couple of years ago, one of these big institutes did a study of stories on the front pages of major U.S. newspapers, and it found that men figured prominently in like 90-something% of all the front page stories in major newspapers. And some of the headlines that I saw reporting this finding said, "Papers biased," right? But now if you think about that, right, if the fact that men are on the front pages more means the papers are biased, what's the implicit background notion of objectivity at work? The image of objectivity there is of some sort of stew, some sort of parity, that, objectivity should reflect all sides, give all disputing parties some of what they seek. Some murky notion like that seems to be what's operative there. But objectivity is not a compromise. It's not moderation. It's not avoiding extremes, the refusal to side with any one party. So the point, again, is objectivity is not a matter of adopting all competing points of view. Whether you are trying on one other person's shoes or a bunch of other people's shoes, you face the same problem. It's equally subjective. Just as no position is correct simply because it's that person's position, no view is correct simply because it's a lot of people's position. Objectivity is not determined relative to others' views of a matter, but relative to the relevant facts. In this example, by the way, there are further confusions. I mean, to speak of a women's point of view is ludicrous. Everyone's perspective, that very idea grows muddy, etc. But I won't go into those for now, okay? Another thing that objectivity is not, it's not a bird's eye view or a God's eye perspective or the view from nowhere, to use a phrase that's become kind of in vogue in philosophy in recent years. There is this prevalent notion that objectivity demands that you somehow escape your particular self, your skin, your experience, and view a situation, quote, as it truly is. You, the observer, the judger, in your particularity, get in the way of objectivity. Now, we talked about this view yesterday. We saw that it is wrong-headed. It's based on a serious misrepresentation of what objectivity is. Necessarily, I see through my eyes, think with my mind, wake up with all my past experience, etc., and so on, for everyone. The standard of objectivity provides a corrective lens, you might say, to any distortions that my eyes, my mind, my background might introduce. Striving for objectivity is a way of compensating for possibly wayward judgments that you might reach. But objectivity does not require that you become some sort of fictional being, this bird that's allegedly can see things from every point of view at once, or a God's eye perspective, okay? Rather, objectivity is a thinking method designed for human beings, as we are, based on our actual nature. Objectivity is based on reality. That's why it works, actually. Right? Okay, moving right along. Yet another widely circulated notion of objectivity, the idea that objectivity is neutral or value-free, disinterested. Harry Binswanger actually referred to this very briefly, but he remarked on this in passing during his lectures earlier this week. Now, it's certainly true that objectivity demands that a person not be subjective. You mustn't allow your ends to distort your judgment. You may not jettison reason's conclusions for sentiment, aims, wishes at a moment's notice. So we must exclude inappropriate values or an inappropriate use of values, allowing values undue influence on your judgment. You mustn't allow your values to trump the facts, to cloud your vision, your logic. But the purpose for which you are thinking about an issue necessarily introduces values. If a person had no interest in the result, I'm thinking about this issue, I'm trying to reach an objective conclusion. I don't care what the result is. What incentive then would that person have to get the facts right, to make sure that his conclusion really was objectively justified? He would have no incentive. If you don't care, why be objective? Let me give you an example from a recent magazine article I read that is an example of this sort of equation of objectivity with being neutral, value-free, okay? An article a few weeks ago in a magazine on standardized admissions tests for schools, colleges, grad schools, so GREs, SATs, LSATs, that's what it was about. The author wrote that the school selection system must appear as objective as possible. And that was his word, appear, as objective as possible. But then in the very next sentence he went on to say, universities must be able to point to value-free measures of applicants to minimize litigation. Implicitly equating the objective with the value-free. Now think about this a second. If admissions decisions were truly devoid, truly, completely, utterly, 100% devoid of all values, how would you decide who should get in? Anybody got a quarter, right? We would flip a coin. I mean, that would be one method of doing it, by completely random means. The point is, even if you exclude factors such as applicants' race or wealth or athletic prowess, etc., presumably, admissions places some value on applicants' intelligence, on their possession of certain intellectual equipment, knowledge, abilities, signs that they are capable of performing the kind of work they're going to have to perform in this graduate school or what have you, right? Now, the notion that objectivity is value-free gets off the ground, I think, because we all know of cases of values being misapplied and thwarting the objectivity of somebody's thinking. Certainly, that's a common enough phenomenon. But rather than accept the image or the ideal that objectivity should be value-free, we've got to specify which values are and aren't relevant to a particular judgment, and why they're relevant, and exactly how they're relevant, in what way they should be considered, okay? Notice that this idea, objectivity should be value-free, also fuels the belief that objectivity is impossible. Because if you insist that objectivity demands disinterest, complete neutrality, and then you find that that is unrealistic, you're going to conclude, oh, well, I guess objectivity is impossible. Nobody could really be objective, okay? So it is important to be clear in distinguishing a proper view of objectivity from some of these false ones. And there's one more thing that objectivity is not that I should talk about. Objectivity is not infallibility. It doesn't entail infallibility. Objectivity isn't a money-back guarantee of the truth, correct conclusions. A jury may proceed scrupulously objectively, properly heeding and weighing each piece of evidence and testimony, but because of factors beyond the jury's control, reach an incorrect verdict, right? Maybe a witness lied, and they had absolutely no reason to suspect that he was lying. Maybe later evidence that wasn't available, that nobody had reason to suspect would ever become available or existed, later became available and showed that their conclusion was incorrect. That doesn't mean that they weren't objective. Or a different example, a sports referee can get a call wrong sometimes through no lack of objectivity on his part. He simply didn't have the best angle for what he saw and what he was calling, okay? When we use instant replay, as we sometimes have in recent years in football, or cyclops in tennis, for those of you who know tennis, right? When we use some of these mechanical devices, we're using them not because people have decided, oh yeah, the officials are corrupt and the games are all, a hoax, etc. No. The recognition is you're capable of an honest mistake even when you are being objective. Sometimes it's hard to see. Sometimes you have a bad angle. Sometimes something obstructs your vision, okay? If you really care about accuracy, you want to get it right, then you're going to use every means at your disposal. So you go to the mechanical backstop things, all right? Now, you might at first, and some people do sometimes, find this a little bit unnerving, a little bit disturbing. Oh, I'm going to be objective, but I'm not going to get, infallibility? No. There's no way around our fallibility. We are fallible. We will remain fallible. Nothing will transform us into error-proof beings who never utter a false word. So objectivity is not a ticket to infallibility. Fallibility is a starting point, a major reason why we need to be objective. If we were always right, if we were infallible, if we were always right and we knew it, we wouldn't have to worry about how we reached conclusions. We wouldn't, reason, objectivity, what a waste of time, okay? All right, that takes care of that first item, various things that objectivity is not. So let's turn then to some more forms of non-objectivity in practice that we may find ourselves falling into. And some of these, I think, could also be organized under traps of irrationality, okay? The first one, which is actually item 2 if you're following on the outline. One serious way, I think, of failing to be objective comes from becoming too adept at seeing things through other people's eyes. Becoming too adept at seeing things, seeing issues through other people's eyes. Other people who you think are mistaken. And using that ability to see it from his point of view to detain you from a return to your own perspective. Lingering that, well, I can kind of see it the way, my sister-in-law sees it. I know, if you look at it that way, blah, blah. And lingering in that view that ultimately you do think is based on mistaken premises, but sort of lingering in that point of view and keeping it, allowing it to keep you from returning to your own judgment of, no, these are the relevant premises here, and these are the proper inferences from those premises. Now notice, it's one thing to be able to see an issue from another person's point of view. It's another to indulge that perspective as if it's reasonable, right? It's the latter that's the real problem, okay? And I've given the problem the deliberately distasteful name chameleonitis, because it's being a chameleon, changing your, if you look at it like that. This can be particularly tempting with a view that you yourself held in the past. Maybe an idea, a belief, a system of beliefs, a religion, for instance, that you were raised on, so that you held in the past, for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. A belief, system of beliefs that your family is still very much committed to. You've got to recognize that just because you can see an issue his way doesn't give his way credence, doesn't elevate his view to equal status with the rational view. Thinking that it does implicitly elevates this other person's consciousness as decisive. Remember, objectivity is not a matter of seeing things from another person's point of view. There is no virtue in that. There is no moral virtue, no epistemological virtue from that. That is not what objectivity is about. A source or a contributor to this, I think, is often this tendency to see things from another person's point of view and sort of, linger there, have it muffle your own judgment. One contributor to this, I think, is other people's relativism. What I mean is simply this. Many of the people that you or I disagree with about a host of issues, many of those people are themselves relativists. And they adopt their relativist attitude toward you or me. And their disagreements with us. They tolerate us, right? It's very big of them. And they let you kind of know it in some way, maybe it's just body language and so on, but they tolerate us. And that somehow seems to demand the same courtesy on our part. And they may even again act subtly as if we owe them the courtesy of tolerating their view. So you fail to fully reject their mistaken view out of a misplaced reciprocity. That, again, I think is a real danger way of failing to be objective. Now, you might think at this stage, one might think, well, if we're excessively generous to others' wrong views, mistaken perspectives, maybe that impedes courage or integrity if a person doesn't speak up for the right view, for instance, right? He doesn't voice his disagreement. But does it really impair your objectivity? I think it does, or I think it certainly can. Insofar as it can dampen your judgment. By not squarely recognizing this other person's mistaken view as mistaken, false, wrong, the effect often is to equalize your conception of the two competing, inconsistent views. It tempts you often to suspend your judgment, to fail to reach a conclusion, to punt on the issue, abdicate, coast away from it without really resolving it, even in your own mind. Remember, the whole point of being objective is to reach conclusions, to reach proper, accurate conclusions. So insofar as it can erode your pursuing the path of logic to an objective conclusion, I think this is a real danger. Okay? Dr. Peikoff, in his lectures several years ago on the art of thinking, which is available on tape, it's in lecture number 1, spoke of not juggling two incompatible perspectives, of working to really root out a wrong perspective to whatever extent it remains at all attractive to you. He told us, we have to actively disintegrate a wrong context, blast it away. And here I think what he's talking about is very helpful. If you deliberately try to lose the ability to even see things from that other mistaken point of view, it'll be a lot harder to indulge that point of view or to give it more respectability than it deserves. Okay? Now, Evan, I am going to ask only because I have a lot to do today. Okay, it's not, okay, thanks. I do hope to have some time for questions at the end, all right? Okay, so that's chameleonitis. A simpler kind of trap away from objectivity. What I've called on the handout, the good guy syndrome, the desire for social approval. A very simple thought here. The desire to be liked often tempts us away from objectivity. You don't want to seem cold, harsh, hard-hearted, vengeful. You seek to be considered a good guy, fair, by other people's standards, of what it is to be a good guy, or fair, or objective, okay? That's the problem. For instance, somebody at the office has asked me for time off, but this particular guy, no, he doesn't deserve it, given his, somewhat inconsistent performance of late and so on. I've thought about it rationally, thoroughly, etc. No, he doesn't deserve it. But if I don't give him the day off, everybody else will think I'm a Scrooge, right? Or if you don't forgive someone, everybody's big on forgiveness, but again, in a case where you have really looked at the situation thoroughly and concluded, this person doesn't deserve my forgiveness. But if I don't, everybody will think I'm a hard ass, right? That's the sort of thing I have in mind here. Deferring to other people's standards of what it is to be a good guy, a good person. In this kind of case, obviously, you have to remind yourself clearly of what your values are, what your principles are. It's useful to probe for the source of your hesitation. Why am I even torn here? Why am I even tempted to not do what I think I should do? Treat him as he deserves, right? And you might find it's a simple case of I just want to be popular with the secretaries, right? You might find it's a case of, I never really understood that point about justice and desert, right? Well, good, then go think about it some more. Reread, some materials, talk to people, think it through further, okay? All right. Another very simple form of non-objectivity, misprioritizing. Misprioritizing. Shuffling your values, allowing lesser values greater weight in your thinking than higher ones. Jurors, for instance, prizing being finished with the whole damn thing, just reaching a verdict, rather than reaching a proper verdict, really doing a responsible job in acquitting their task, okay? Or, you finally have that doctor visit. You've been having a few symptoms of some, disturbing things. Took you months to get in to see the doctor. You finally see the doctor. You're in there and you've talked about the one problem, and now you face the choice. Well, I could bring up the other one, but the Mets are on in 20 minutes, right? Misprioritizing. If you elevate lesser goals over greater, more significant goals, you're going to jostle your understanding of what is relevant evidence, what the relevant facts are. And that is naturally going to lead to non-objective decisions. So beware of the sorts of self-deception and context dropping that can result in this kind of misprioritizing. It's a track away from objectivity. Yet another one, impatience. Impatience. Sometimes, in rushing to have an issue decided, you forge ahead when you don't really yet have enough information. You want to make a decision, you want to have the issue resolved, so you force the issue, even if you're not yet adequately informed about all of the important, relevant issues. You take a shortcut past objectivity. This is often a form of emotionalism, right? Indulging the desire for resolution now over the requirements of a proper resolution of the issue. And I think there's a useful lesson with this one. We need to be objective both in making decisions and in recognizing when we're ready to make a decision. When have I got enough information? When do I need to wait for more or go out and search for some more information? Okay? You need to be objective at both stages, at both levels. Emotionalism is often underneath other forms of non-objectivity, such as the next few. Selective attention is another one. Selective attention to evidence, to facts. Discounting or ignoring certain evidence. Obviously, this can be a form of dropping context, enabling you to act as if certain information isn't relevant. So some examples of this sort of selective attention. Our Secretary of State informs us Hussein has promised to abide by this agreement. You know, we finally reached an agreement, and Hussein has promised to abide by it. Completely tuning out his repeated promises and violations of past agreements, right? Acting as if words, his latest words, are all that matter, all we have to go on. And words are not verified by actions, right? Just tune that out. Selectively attend to, he signed this document, right? Or, the student tried hard. The student put in a lot of effort, so give him the A. Selectively attending to those admirable features, he tried hard, he worked hard, tuning out the fact that what he wrote is a mess. You know, it's stream of consciousness, just a stream of non sequiturs or what have you. Yet another form of non-objectivity. Inappropriately indulging your preconceptions. Inappropriately indulging your preconceptions. And I want to be careful here. Please listen carefully to get what I mean and what I don't mean. Okay, so don't tune out midway through this one because there's an important clarification at the end of it, so I'm not misunderstood. Okay. The mistake here is to read all incoming data in a way suited to support a preformed thesis. Interpreting all evidence as corroborating a conclusion that you've already reached, regardless of whether the evidence really does corroborate that conclusion. Okay, that's a problem. That's not objective. For instance, suppose you've concluded the culture is hopeless, you know, despite whatever other people might say at this conference or what have you, the culture is hopeless. Suppose you've decided that. And you then view absolutely everything in that light, never allowing anything that you become aware of to challenge it, to register under the, well, maybe it's not so bad column, okay? Or another example of this sort of inappropriately indulging preconceptions, you decide a person is lazy and you tune out all subsequent evidence that maybe he's not, or maybe he's changed. Even if he was once lazy, maybe in the intervening years he has reformed, or something like that. The point is, you mustn't treat evidence as mere props for your independently held beliefs. You've got to look at what the evidence shows. Not at what you want it to show, or what you expect it to show, or you've already decided that it will show. Okay? Now, the clarification here. I'm not saying that you should approach every issue, every decision, as if you're an idiot, an empty head, you were born yesterday, right? And you don't have, any principle, any knowledge of Ayn Rand, any knowledge of reason or egoism or individual rights in your head. That is not what I'm saying. That's actually why I said inappropriately indulging preconceptions, to try to make this clear. Rather, what I'm saying is you've got to be objective. You've got to guard against inappropriate reliance on prior beliefs simply because they're prior. Because those beliefs settled in your head first already. Obviously, judgment is greatly facilitated by your principles and past knowledge. So keep your knowledge. Use your principles. But beware of preconceptions about particulars. Example. You hear somebody's an objectivist. Now, obviously not somebody at this conference, but out there in the rest of the world, right? Oh, this person's an objectivist, and your immediate conclusion might well be, good person, right? And then you get to know him. And you may have sometimes had this experience, right? Probably most of us have. And you might conclude not a good person, right? Maybe he doesn't really understand the philosophy, or he's only sympathetic with one narrow piece of it, or he doesn't really practice it, or he, to some extent he practices it, but for other reasons he's a jerk, okay? Whatever. Obviously, a quick, hasty conclusion, based on this preconception, all objectivists are good people, or all alleged objectivists are good people. You've got to find out about him to learn exactly what he is and isn't, what characteristics he has. You've got to use your principles to judge specifics, not to ignore specifics, okay? Prior knowledge and principles are not a license to bypass looking at concretes. They're not substitutes for thinking about what is before you. And one further point on this. Inappropriately indulging your preconceptions impedes your acquisition of knowledge. That's why it's bad. The problem with it isn't simply it's unfair to other people, in those cases when it's other people who you're judging, right? That's not the real core fundamental problem with it. The problem is it's foolish from the point of view of your own interest. When you inappropriately indulge your preconceptions, you're blocking out evidence that might lead you to learn more, to expand your knowledge, to revise some of the conclusions you had previously drawn. Okay? So it's stupid from an egoistic point of view. It's anti-egoistic. All right? Okay. Something like an opposite problem. And that is keeping an eternally or indefinitely open mind. Thinking that objectivity demands hearing all sides of a story, all perspectives on an issue ad infinitum. Clearly there's a problem of closure here. Failing to reach a decision. Now, on occasion, it is appropriate to temporarily suspend judgment if you don't yet have adequate information on which to base a decision. But that's not an excuse for never reaching a decision. To do that fails to be objective. Sometimes this tendency to never reach a decision, keep this open mind indefinitely, sometimes this tendency arises from a confusion about what it means to consider all angles, or an ambiguity about what it is to accord different points of view equal standing. That idea of equal standing is sometimes misinterpreted to mean that competing views are equally valid. But look, in court, the prosecution and the defense both have legal standing. They both get to make their case. That doesn't mean that every verdict must split the difference between them. Right? That both parties must be satisfied in some way, to some extent. That both sides have some validity to what they're saying. There's a simple but important difference between considering all relevant evidence, hearing all sides of a story, and all sides in a dispute, and paying them equal weight, giving them equal credibility once you have heard them and assessed what the different points of view are. Doing that, though, thinking the only way to listen to all sides of a story is to give them equal credence, if that's your attitude, of course, that's going to keep you from reaching a decision that one claim is correct. This claim is justified and this or that other one, those are unjustified. Okay. This can arise from reifying the means of objectivity and forgetting about its purpose. If you just stress, we've got to look at this from every possible angle, if you treat that as an end in itself, looking from every possible angle, you're forgetting that the reason for doing that is because it's a path to finding out what the true story, the right conclusion really is. Okay, yet another form of non-objectivity. Groundless second-guessing. Second-guessing yourself, but groundlessly second-guessing. Now notice, this one often stems from a good impulse. You want to check up on yourself. You don't want to indulge in the various forms of irrationality or non-objectivity that we've been talking about. But if you harbor doubts about your judgment without grounds, that's destructive. There's no virtue in doing that. For instance, again, we'll put you in the office, right? You've decided you've got to fire this person. Again, you have thought about it very carefully, very thoroughly, every angle, every piece of relevant evidence, etc. You've reached the conclusion you got to let this guy go. But maybe I should keep him on. It's not that there's any particular thought behind that maybe I should keep him on. It's not that you've just learned something else, some mitigating factor about why he's been doing poorly lately or anything like that. It's just this floating doubt that occurs to you. Or you're preparing work for a big meeting. And you've already decided about how much time you should put in on this, given the importance of the project, the difficulty of the project, other projects you've got going on, etc., right? So you put in the 12 hours or whatever it might be that you had decided. But then, the doubt crops up, but maybe I haven't prepared enough. And you think, well, now, did you misjudge something? Was it more complicated than you expected? Did something arise that you hadn't anticipated that's going to demand more time? Did you really put in the time you said you would, right? And if you answer all of those questions, no, I put in enough time, et cetera, but you still have this groundless doubt, but maybe I should, I'm not prepared enough. Maybe I should do another 4 hours. That's destructive. When such hesitations occur to you, you've got to pursue their source. Look for the roots of them. That clearly can be very useful. Often it leads you to more precise identifications of what the relevant considerations are in a given case. It can lead you to reconsider how much work you're doing and need to do, whether a person should be let go or what have you. But second-guessing yourself without such bases, or when your inquiries into, why am I feeling this doubt, this hesitation, when those inquiries turn up nothing, to continue to harbor these doubts is pointless. And it is harmful. It injects a kind of wild card that stops your thinking and undercuts your confidence in your judgment. To be objective, you should pursue what there is reason to pursue, what there is evidence that, when there is evidence that needs to be pursued. But you shouldn't elevate any thought that occurs to you, any possibility that occurs to you, into the equivalent of newly uncovered evidence. The thought occurred to me, but maybe I shouldn't do this. To do that, to elevate any thought that occurs to you into the same status of a new piece of evidence, is a form of indulging the arbitrary. It's a kind of epistemological egalitarianism, granting equal footing to any thought that occurs to you. It reflects primacy of consciousness, I think. You're not going by the object, the relevant evidence here, but by the state of your consciousness. It's subjective, okay? All right, now let's see. Yeah, to leave enough time for questions, I think I'll skip the next one, which I had called optional on the original outline. And we can then turn to objectivity's requirements. That's it for the various forms of non-objectivity that we can be tempted into. Again, by no means an exhaustive list, but some things to be on the lookout for. So just a few thoughts on objectivity's requirements. Again, there's considerable overlap with the requirements of rationality. If you were to look back at your notes from a few days ago, review the list of things needed for rationality, you would find fairly obviously that everything required for rationality is also required for objectivity. I spoke there, in regard to rationality, about the need for effort and time and integration and identification and honesty and independence. Rather than revisit each of those, though, I simply want to notice a few dimensions of objectivity's demands that might be useful to highlight, okay? First of all, objectivity demands clear and valid goals to determine relevance. We spoke yesterday a lot about going by the relevant evidence, and again, the way to figure out what's relevant is by reference to your purpose. You have to have clear and valid goals in order to be objective. Objectivity is a matter of focusing on the object, heeding the relevant evidence. So clear goals are crucial to sorting out what is and isn't relevant. Now, obviously, again, you've got to make sure that your purposes or goals are themselves valid in light of higher purposes traced all the way back to the requirements of your life. That can get tricky sometimes. Being objective will sometimes demand that you rethink your purposes, that you walk through your reasons for adopting them again and the implications of these purposes on other aspects of your life to make sure that they are completely compatible with your ultimate goal of living, of life, okay? Being objective is also sometimes going to demand that you rethink your inductions about what material is relevant to a purpose, what you need to pay attention to in order to figure out how to advance a purpose. Once your goals are clear, though, once you've settled them and sharply defined them, objectivity demands exclusive focus on what's relevant. It demands ruthless discriminating of relevant from irrelevant considerations. Once you've identified something as irrelevant to the question that's immediately before you, that you're trying to address, once you've identified it as irrelevant, you've got to set it aside and not look back. Decisively discard the irrelevant. Don't let it haunt you, a sort of inversion of that groundless second guessing, okay? Set it aside and don't look back. Second point, requirement of objectivity. Objectivity does require a wholehearted commitment to the propriety of thinking and judging. You've got to shed any lingering ambivalence you may carry about judgment in general and about your own judgment. We live amidst people constantly preaching, you shouldn't be judgmental, right? Who am I to judge? Who are you to judge? We hear this all the time. Objectivists know we judge or we die. No apologies necessary. Life, your lives, life depends on using your mind to gain knowledge of the world, to identify things, to integrate your knowledge, to draw conclusions. Your enjoyment of everything dear to you depends on your actions, on how you act in order to gain those things and keep those things and flourish, go further with those things, gain further values. But your actions depend on your judgments. So this is why I say it's crucial to shed any ambivalence about your own judgment. I'm not prescribing, certainly, blind faith in your own judgment simply because it's yours. You've got to judge yourself objectively, too, including any doubts that occur to you. I'm not saying, just dismiss all doubts, No, groundless doubts should be dismissed. But first, make sure it's groundless by objectively evaluating any doubts, okay? But what I am saying is that an unqualified commitment to judgment, particularly to rational and objective judgment, is necessary as a way of embracing your values and your life. That, I think, we've really got to sort of set like cement in our minds. Okay? And finally, a fairly obvious requirement out of a few of the traps that I was reciting earlier today, again, independence. I say again because it was also one that I mentioned in regard to rationality. Independence is another requirement of objectivity. Remember some of the pulls away from being objective, the desire to seem a good guy to others, the chameleon tendency to see things from other people's point of view. Being objective demands proceeding by your own honest first-hand judgment of the issue in front of you. It demands abandoning the social metaphysics that urges appeasement of other people's terms, abandoning any sort of accommodation with contrary premises. It does demand independence. Okay, let's have some questions. I want to reserve the last minute to have the last word, okay? But this will leave us a few minutes for questions. Yes, Evan.
With regard to taking someone else's context or stepping inside their shoes, while that's not necessary to judge the truth or value of what they say, I think it is relevant if you're evaluating them as a person. In other words, to try to differentiate, are they making an honest error? Can I see what error they're making?
Right.
Or can I understand how fundamental an error they're making? To make those types of assessment, you sometimes do need to understand their context.
Right. No, that sounds true, right? But that is a significantly different type of judgment. What you're saying does sound true. If the object being considered is that person, I'm trying to figure out, is this an honest person? Is this an intelligent person? Is this a qualified person for this job? Yes, in that case, to make that kind of judgment, it can be relevant to ask yourself, well, if I were in his shoes, would I have made the same boneheaded mistake that he made, et cetera, okay? But we do want to keep, that is useful, okay? Because sometimes we are judging other people. But you don't want to lapse from that into thinking that to judge, well, is capitalism a good system? Well, he grew up in Nigeria or something. As if that should make a difference, okay? Yes?
I know of a particular, skepticist argument, which I hope you could answer. You mentioned about being objective with respect to deciding when you're ready to make a decision.
Yeah.
And they say, well, you're making a decision. How do you know you're ready to make the decision to decide?
Yeah, okay, but sorry, no disrespect. That just sounds so stupid, right? They're looking for some sort of, we decide, we make decisions. We should be thinking all the time, right? Again, what are they looking for? It sounds like they're looking for something a kind of analog to the birdseye perspective I was talking about, a sort of non-decision decision. Because there's, but and again, I think honest introspection is a useful thing, which a lot of the people you talk to have no clue of, and it seems sometimes when talking to people as if they've never honestly introspected, or maybe they have, but they're never going to let themselves live with what they found, right? Honest introspection often reveals, I rushed that one. I had these misgivings. I knew that there were some other factors that I should consider, but I wanted, to get home and see the Mets game or to have this issue with the office resolved or whatever it might be. I mean, if you start paying attention to your own mind and your own thinking, you can often see, you can pinpoint where you went wrong. I'm not saying this is easy. I mean, it becomes easier, I think, with practice, but sorry, I'm inarticulate in...
At some point, you just have to use faith to make.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thing they're saying, but no, it's not a matter of faith. It's also a matter of realizing the point of thinking is to act. We have to reach conclusions, right? And yeah, you can be open to revise a conclusion if later evidence shows you or indicates to you that you may have made a mistake. If I later realize there was good reason to think I might have made a mistake, let me pursue this evidence further and so on, right? You're still doing that when you're making decisions. But, you're still open to that when you're making decisions. Yes?
I wondered if you had any ideas on ways to prompt other people, say people you work with, into a more objective mode of thinking or into the objective mode.
That's an interesting question. Any ways of prompting other non-objectivist people into being more objective in their thinking? I don't have any grandiose strategies for this, but I would say that, perhaps some of the sorts of clarifications that I was talking about earlier today, in particular when I was saying, but objectivity is not A, B, and C. It's not a bird's eye view. It's not infallibility. It's not value neutral. What was the first one? That was the one I'm really looking for here. It's not seeing things from another person's point of view. I don't think it's that difficult to show how stupid that view is. I mean, to a semi-rational person, they can sort of get how, well, if it's not right just because I think so, well, then if I get, my friend Andy or something in his point of view, oh yeah, he might equally be mistaken. That is not that difficult an idea to grasp. So in that sense, I would say, if one really does try to do this, which is a wonderful thing to try to do, just slow people down to get them to be more objective, then I think depending on what it is they're being non-objective about and the particular form of non-objectivity that they're engaging in, I think you could just start by trying to address the particular mistake they're making, which is often a form of one of these forms of confusion. Go ahead. Sure.
Is a problem. One of the statements I have tried, and I'm not sure where I'm going with that, is, well, what would an outside independent reviewer think of this? Or how would they approach the situation? I'm not sure whether I'm gearing people into one of the unfortunate other ways of being non-objective.
Well, that sounds like it might depend on the case, because obviously being subjective, just going by what I want, what I feel, and tuning out certain other relevant considerations, that's a common way of not being objective, indulging some variation of subjectivity like that. Obviously, again, you don't want to foster the view that disinterest is what makes something objective, what makes a conclusion objective.
An objective reviewer.
Yeah, but again, simply using the word objective for a lot of people isn't going to be enough because there are such confused notions of what objectivity is out there. Sometimes even that can start people at least in checking against their own subjective tendencies. But you just simply using the word objective, it's so confused in people's mind. Think of that, newspapers biased because they don't have women. The ideas are so bad that you need often to say a little bit more than that, I think, to start people thinking more clearly. Yeah?
Would you comment on that confusion concerning burden of proof?
The burden of proof? Okay. Here's what I had in mind roughly. And again, I think this comes from a good tendency that people often have, and that objectivists often have. You want to be fair. You want to be objective, right? If you don't really understand the burden of proof, if you don't understand that principle, you will get yourself into situations where you're trying to prove things that can't be proved, that do not need to be proven. And then, when you can't prove it, you'll think, oh, well, gee, I guess I can't hold the conclusion anymore that I thought I could hold. And you'll adopt a kind of agnosticism as a result of your failure. So there's if you don't really understand that the burden of proof is on he who asserts the positive, he who says that something is so, that something exists, has a certain characteristic, etc. If that isn't really clear in your mind, and here's again a case where I would say, especially those of you newer to objectivism, that is like one of my all-time favorite principles, and it's so important in philosophy. You've really got to get the burden of proof. But if you don't, you will be led by some of your own epistemological virtues to think you've got to be agnostic on certain issues. You will say to yourself, for instance, my friend, the herbalist, says that echinacea can cure cancer. He can't prove it. But if you try to prove that it doesn't, and you find you can't prove the negative that it doesn't, you might conclude, well, he can't prove it does, I can't prove it doesn't. Gee, I don't know, right? And you'll suspend your judgment and adopt that agnostic position, as opposed to the true objective conclusion there. So that's the kind of danger that I had in mind. Okay? Yeah. Anything else? Ready for the quick conclusion, and then we'll actually end early? Really? You're ready. It's been a long week. Okay, all I wanted to say in conclusion is, again, by no means definitive accounts. I must say, this has raised a lot of more even just the 2 weeks of giving this course here has generated further questions in my own mind about a lot of this material. But it's been another round of the spiral. Useful, hopefully, in developing each of our understanding of these concepts, adding to them. And the point of understanding rationality and objectivity better is to enhance our practice of them. I'll hit it over the head one last time, okay? The point of being rational and objective is grasp of reality. And the point of grasping reality is to make good decisions about how to act so that we can live and prosper. The one thing we all do all day long is make choices. That starts as soon as you get up in the morning. You're making choices about what to do. You're making choices about what to think, whether to pursue that thought that occurs to you, whether to drop that other idea, etc. Rationality and objectivity are about making good choices one at a time. So, I wish you rational and objective choices. Non-contradictory identifications, non-contradictory integrations, and most importantly, the reward that all that rationality and objectivity gives you. Long lives enjoying reality. Okay, thank you.